For the residents of Blackwood Ridge, the logic of the high plains was written in timber and nails, a rigid script of vertical lines meant to defy the horizontal infinity of the horizon. When Elsbeth Thorne, a woman of 40 winters and hardened hands, began to dig a hole into the south-facing slope of her property, the town did not see engineering. They saw the onset of madness born from grief. Elsbeth had buried her husband 2 years prior, a man of good intentions but poor constitution, and since then she had maintained the homestead with a silence that unnerved the gregarious souls at the general store. She stood on the precipice of the ridge, looking not at the sweeping majesty of the sunset, but at the angle of the light and the way the frost clung to the northern shadows of the scrub brush. Her boots, worn leather cracked by the alkali dust, were planted firmly on the earth, the very earth she intended to weaponize against the coming season. The wind here was not merely a movement of air. It was a physical assailant, a thief that stripped heat from flesh and board alike. Elsbeth knew that to build up was to invite the wind to batter, to pry, and ultimately to conquer. Her plan was unconventional, born from a ragged almanac and her own observations of the burrowing hares that survived while the cattle froze. She would not build a henhouse that stood defiant against the sky. She would build one that surrendered to the soil, sinking the structure deep enough to tap into the thermal inertia of the planet itself. As she staked out the perimeter with twine and ash stakes, her niece, Ada, watched with wide, dark eyes. The girl, orphaned by a fever the previous spring, was Elsbeth's shadow, silent and watchful. Together they looked like specters on the hillside, marking a grave for a giant, or so the neighbors whispered as they rode past on their way to the mill. Elsbeth's design was specific, governed by the physics of the sun and the soil. She marked a rectangle 12 feet by 8, oriented so the long side faced true south. This was not a guess, it was a calculation. The winter sun, low in the southern sky, would need to penetrate deep into the structure, heating the earthen floor, which would then release that warmth slowly through the long, bitter nights. Conversely, the summer sun, high and harsh, would strike the roof and the sod, keeping the interior cool. It was a passive engine of survival, requiring no coal, no wood stove, and no prayer. But to the men of Blackwood Ridge, who measured success by the height of a barn's gable, Elsbeth was merely digging a pit. They did not understand that she was effectively removing the variables of wind chill and convection from the equation of her flock's survival. She adjusted a stake, checking the line against the horizon, her face set in a mask of concentration that allowed no room for doubt. The skepticism arrived on the third day of excavation, carried in the saddlebags of Thaddeus Miller, a cattleman who owned the adjacent section. He was a man who believed in tradition, in the way things had always been done in the lush valleys of the East, regardless of how ill-suited those methods were to the brutal steppes of the West. He rode up to the fence line, his horse snorting in the crisp autumn air, and watched Elsbeth drive a spade into the resistant clay. She did not stop working. She merely leveraged her weight against the handle, the muscles in her forearms corded like rope, and turned the earth. Thaddeus watched for a long minute, shifting his weight in the saddle, waiting for a greeting that did not come. Finally he cleared his throat, a sound meant to command attention. "Digging a root cellar, Mrs. Thorne?" Thaddeus called out, his voice carrying a tone of patronizing curiosity. "Seems a mite far from the house for fetching potatoes in a blizzard." Elsbeth paused then, resting her boot on the shoulder of the spade. She looked up, shielding her eyes with a gloved hand. "Not for potatoes, Mr. Miller, for the reds and the leghorns." Thaddeus laughed, a sharp barking sound that startled a crow from a nearby fence post. "Chickens? You're putting birds in a hole? They'll rot from the damp before the frost even sets in. Birds need air, woman. They need a coop with slats." Elsbeth looked at him, her expression unreadable. They need warmth, Thaddeus, and slats let in the death. The earth holds the heat. The wind takes it. Thaddeus shook his head, a smirk playing under his mustache. It's a folly. You're building a grave is what you're doing. When the snowmelt comes, you'll have a soup of mud and drowned feathers. My boys are raising a new timber coop next week. Proper lumber, cedar shingles. That's how you keep stock. Elsbeth returned her gaze to the trench. Cedar has an R value of nearly nothing when the wind is howling at 40 knots, Mr. Miller, but thank you for the concern. She drove the spade back into the dirt, dismissing him with the resumption of her labor. Thaddeus lingered a moment longer, muttering about stubborn women and wasted effort, before spurring his horse toward town, eager to share the tale of the Widow Thorne's mud pit folly at the saloon. He did not see Ada, sitting quietly by the pile of excavated dirt, carefully separating the stones from the clay, her small hands mimicking the methodical efficiency of her aunt. The excavation process was a grueling testament to human endurance. This was not a matter of simply removing dirt. It was a precise surgical operation on the landscape. Elsbeth and Ada worked in a rhythm that defied the passage of time. Their days measured in cubic feet of soil moved. They dug down 4 feet, a specific depth chosen to sit below the frost line, ensuring that the ground temperature would remain constant at roughly 50 degrees, regardless of the surface chaos. The topsoil was carefully set aside to be used later for the roof, while the heavy clay beneath was packed into molds to form adobe-like blocks for the front wall. Elsbeth was meticulous about the slope of the floor, grading it slightly toward the entrance to ensure that any moisture that did intrude would drain away rather than pool. The labor was brutal. The ground in the Dakota Territory was ancient and tightly packed, a dense matrix of roots and rocks that resisted every inch of progress. Elsbeth's hands, already calloused, grew harder, the skin taking on the texture of cured rawhide. She taught Ada the physics of leverage, how to use the handle of the pickaxe as a fulcrum, how to let the weight of the tool do the work rather than the strength of the back. They worked in silence mostly, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of iron on earth and the heavy exhalations of breath. When they hit a seam of particularly stubborn rock, Elsbeth did not curse. She simply changed her angle, chipping away at the periphery until the obstacle was isolated and could be pried loose. It was a lesson in patience and geometry, a practical application of the stoicism she lived by. As the pit deepened, the town's mockery evolved from amusement to active derision. Riders passing on the trail would slow down to point and jeer. "Best get a priest to bless that tomb, Elsbeth," one would shout. Another would ask if she planned to bury herself in it when the winter snapped her mind. Elsbeth never responded. She understood that their mockery was a defense mechanism, a way to reinforce their own fragile choices in a land that offered no guarantees. They clung to the familiar shapes of barns and coops because the alternative, admitting that the landscape required a fundamental change in their way of life, was too terrifying to contemplate. She focused instead on the temperature of the soil against her palm. Even now, with the autumn air turning crisp, the earth at the bottom of the excavation felt warm, a stored battery of summer's energy waiting to be used. The construction phase moved from excavation to structural engineering. Once the hole was squared and leveled, Elsbeth began the framework. She did not have the money for milled lumber, nor did she trust it. Instead, she used locust posts harvested from the creek bed, dense, rot-resistant wood that she had seasoned over the summer. She set these posts deep into the corners of the dugout, tamping the earth around them until they were as immovable as the hill itself. Across the top, she laid a ridgepole of heavy oak, creating a slope that angled back into the hill. The roof was the critical component. It could not just be wood, it had to be a continuation of the hill. She wove a lattice of willow branches between the rafters, creating a dense, flexible mat. On top of this, she layered prairie grass, dried and bundled tight to act as insulation. But the final layer was the master stroke. She took the squares of sod she had carefully cut during the first days of digging, dense bricks of root and soil, and laid them over the grass side up. In time, the roots would grow together, knitting the roof into a living organism that would shed water and hold heat. From a distance, the hen house became invisible, merely a slight undulation in the hillside, betrayed only by the door frame and the south-facing window. Ventilation was the paradox that baffled her neighbors, but for Elsbeth it was simple fluid dynamics. She knew that while warmth was essential, moisture was the killer. Chicken droppings released ammonia. Their breath released vapor. In a sealed box, this dampness would freeze on their combs and wattles, causing frostbite and death. She constructed a wooden shaft at the rear of the dugout, extending up through the earthen roof. It acted as a chimney. As the warm air from the birds rose, it would exit through the shaft, drawing fresh, drier air in through a low vent near the door. It was a passive air pump, driven by the heat of the chickens themselves. While Thaddeus Miller was nailing expensive glass windows into his drafty, vertical coop, Elsbeth was calculating airflow rates and checking the seals on her intake vents. The front of the dugout, the only part exposed to the air, was built from the clay blocks she had pressed and dried in the sun. She mortared them with a mix of mud and straw, smoothing the joints with her bare hands until the wall was seamless. Into this wall she set a window she had scavenged, a double-paned sash from an abandoned homestead miles away. She angled the frame specifically to catch the low winter sun. Inside, she whitewashed the earthen walls with a mixture of lime and water. It wasn't for decoration. The white surface would reflect the sunlight that entered the window, diffusing it throughout the dugout to keep the birds active and laying longer into the short days. Every detail was functional. Every choice was dictated by the harsh reality of the environment. By late November, the landscape had turned the color of iron. The sky hung low and heavy, a bruising purple that promised violence. The grasses had withered to brittle stalks that hissed in the wind. The neighbors had finished their preparations, their properties dotted with neat, painted structures that stood out starkly against the brown earth. They looked civilized, they looked orderly, and to Elsbeth's eyes they looked terribly fragile. She began the process of moving her flock. She had 30 birds, Rhode Island Reds and Plymouth Rocks, sturdy breeds but flesh and blood nonetheless. As she carried them 2 by 2 into the dugout, they clucked nervously, disoriented by the transition from the open run to the subterranean shelter. But as soon as they settled, the change in their behavior was immediate. Outside, the wind was already picking up, biting at exposed skin with a temperature dropping toward freezing. Inside the dugout, the air was still. It smelled of earth and lime, not the acrid dust of the open plains. The silence was profound. The wind's roar was muffled to a distant hum by feet of soil. The thermometer Elsbeth had hung on the center post read 52 degrees, while the outside air hovered near 30. The thermal mass was already working. Ada sat in the corner on an overturned bucket, watching the birds scratch contentedly in the deep litter of straw Elsbeth had laid down. "It's quiet," Ada whispered, her voice bouncing softly off the curved earthen walls. "It's safe," Elsbeth corrected, closing the heavy insulated door and latching it against the coming dark. The first test arrived a week later, not as a storm, but as a plummeting mercury. The Great White Death, as the old-timers called it, was gathering its breath in the north, but the precursor was a cold snap that shattered records. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. Up at the Miller place, Thaddeus and his sons were frantically nailing tarps over the north side of their new coop, trying to stop the drafts that were whistling through the slat boards. The wood, contracting in the extreme cold, had opened gaps, and the expensive heater they had installed was guzzling kerosene while the heat vanished instantly through the uninsulated walls. Elsbeth stood by her kitchen window, watching the frenetic lantern light bobbing in the distance at the Miller farm. She took a lantern of her own and walked out into the night. The cold was shocking, a physical blow that made the lungs ache. The wind chill was well below zero. She crunched through the frosted grass to the dugout. The door was rimed with frost on the outside. She lifted the latch and pushed. As the door swung inward, a puff of warm, humid air escaped, fogging around her face. She stepped inside and closed the world out. The difference was staggering. It was not hot. It was not a parlor by a fire, but it was alive. The thermometer read 48 degrees. The chickens were roosting on the ladder perches she had built, fluffed up but calm. There was no frost on their combs. The water in the font was liquid, not a block of ice. The physics of the earth were holding the line. She checked the ventilation shaft. A steady, barely perceptible draft was moving up and out, carrying the moisture away. She checked the bedding. It was dry. She sat for a moment in the dark warmth, listening to the soft cooing of the birds, feeling the immense weight of the earth above and around her as a protective embrace rather than a burial. She thought of Thaddeus, battling the wind with canvas and nails, trying to impose his will on a force that could not be bullied. She had not fought nature. She had allied with it. She checked the latch one last time, patted the heavy timber of the doorframe, and stepped back out into the biting cold, a grim satisfaction settling in her chest. The storm had not even begun, and the divergence had started. The vindication was not yet public, but in the quiet dark of the dugout, the victory of engineering over tradition was already absolute. The storm did not arrive with the theatrics of thunder or the warning of a darkening horizon. It arrived as a wall of white erasure, a meteorological hammer that struck the high plains shortly after midnight. The wind shifted from a moan to a scream, hitting velocities that stripped the last dead leaves from the cottonwoods and turned the falling snow into horizontal projectiles. Inside her cabin, Elsbeth Thorne lay awake, listening to the timbers of her own home groan under the assault. The cabin, built in the traditional style by her late husband, shuddered with every gust, the drafts hissing through chinking that had dried and cracked over the years. Beside her, Ada slept fitfully, burrowed under 3 heavy quilts, the air in the bedroom already turning sharp and biting as the fire in the hearth burned low. But Elsbeth's mind was not on the cabin. Her thoughts were projected 50 yards south, beneath the surface of the hill. The storm outside was a ground blizzard, a phenomenon where the wind lifts loose snow and mixes it with falling precipitation to create a suffocating, blinding density. For any structure standing vertically, this was a structural nightmare. The wind load on a flat wall at 60 miles per hour was immense, capable of tearing siding loose and driving ice crystals into wood grain until the timber shattered. However, for the dugout, the physics were entirely different. As the wind roared over the crest of the hill, the dugout's low profile created a localized zone of low pressure. Instead of hammering against the structure, the wind flowed over it. The snow, rather than being a burden, began to drift heavily over the sod roof. To the uninitiated, this burying looked like a disaster. To Elsbeth, it was the final layer of insulation. Snow, composed largely of trapped air, is an excellent insulator. As the drifts deepened to 3, then 4 feet atop the henhouse, the dugout was effectively being wrapped in a thermal blanket, sealing it off completely from the sub-zero wind chill that was scouring the surface world. For 3 days, the world ceased to exist. There was only the white noise of the gale and the encroaching cold. Elsbeth kept the stove in the cabin stoked to a roar, burning through her winter woodpile at a terrifying rate just to keep the interior temperature above freezing. She could not go outside. To step out into the whiteout without a guide rope was suicide. Men had frozen to death 5 yards from their own doors in storms like this. disoriented by the sensory deprivation. She paced the floorboards, her eyes drawn constantly to the frost creeping up the inside of the window panes, a fern-like pattern of ice that thickened by the hour. She imagined the scene at the Miller farm. Thaddeus had built his coop high and proud, a box of pine boards sitting on stone pilings to keep the damp out. She knew the physics of that design intimately. The wind would be sweeping underneath the floorboards, stripping away heat from all 6 sides of the cube. The thermal bridging through the nails would carry the cold deep into the wood. The kerosene heater he had bragged about would be fighting a losing battle against the laws of thermodynamics, consuming fuel to heat air that was instantly sucked out through the rattling gaps in the siding. When the wind finally died on the morning of the 4th day, it left behind a silence so profound it felt heavy. The sun rose on a landscape that had been alien sculpted. The familiar contours of the ridge were gone, smoothed over by massive, undulating drifts of snow that sparkled with a blinding, diamond-hard brilliance. The temperature was 20 degrees below zero, the air so dry and cold it scorched the throat. Elsbeth wasted no time. She bundled Ada into layers of wool and leather until the girl looked like a round bear cub, and they stepped out onto the porch. The snow was packed hard enough to walk on in places, wind-scoured to concrete density. They moved toward the hill, or where the hill used to be. The dugout was entirely gone, buried under a drift that crested 10 feet high. To a panicked eye, it would look as though the chickens were entombed. But Elsbeth carried a shovel and a long iron probe. She knew the geometry of her land. She located the depression that marked the entrance ramp and began to dig. This was not the frenzied digging of a rescue. It was the methodical removal of a barrier. She cut blocks of snow and moved them aside, creating a canyon that led down to the heavy timber door. As she dug deeper, the color of the snow changed from blinding white to a shadowed blue. Finally, her shovel struck the wood of the door frame. It was dry. The overhang of the sod roof had done its job, preventing the drift from packing directly against the planks. Ada stood at the top of the snow trench, holding the egg basket, her breath pluming in the frigid air. Elsbeth brushed the remaining powder from the latch, took a breath to steady her own anxiety, and lifted the iron bar. The door groaned on its hinges, the leather seals she had tacked around the frame peeling away from the jamb with a soft tearing sound. As the door swung open, it was not the smell of death that greeted them, but the warm, earthy scent of living creatures. A cloud of steam rolled out, meeting the Arctic air and instantly crystallizing into fog. Elsbeth stepped inside. The transition was physical, like walking into a different latitude. The thermometer on the post read 45 degrees, a 65-degree difference from the air outside. The chickens, hearing the intrusion, clucked softly, a low, contented murmur. They were not huddled in a desperate pile for warmth. They were moving about the floor, scratching in the deep litter. The thermal mass of the earth had held. The heat generated by 30 avian bodies, trapped by the sod and the snow blanket, had maintained a localized tropical zone in the midst of a frozen hell. Elsbeth checked the water font. It had a thin skim of ice on the surface, easily broken with a finger, but the water beneath was liquid. She checked the combs of the leghorns, the breed most susceptible to frostbite. They were bright red and fleshy, with no sign of the blackening necrosis that claimed birds in drafty coops. She moved to the nesting boxes, her heart hammering a rhythm of vindication against her ribs. She reached a hand into the straw of the first box and felt the smooth, warm curve of an egg. Then another, and another. The birds, stress-free and warm, had continued to lay. She filled the basket Ada had brought down, the brown shells distinct and shocking against the backdrop of the winter crisis. As they emerged from the dugout, the basket heavy with food, the sound of shouting drifted across the crystallized fields. Thaddeus Miller was wading through the drifts at the property line, his movements jerky and frantic. Elsbeth waited, standing atop the snow-covered roof of her Triumph, the basket hooked over her arm. Thaddeus looked wrecked. His face was chapped raw by the wind, his eyes hollowed by exhaustion. He had spent 3 nights feeding a heater that couldn't keep up, watching his investment freeze by degrees. He stopped at the fence, seeing Elsbeth and the child standing there, not merely surviving, but thriving. He looked at the basket. He saw the eggs. The reality of it seemed to strike him with more force than the blizzard. "Lost 'em," he rasped, his voice cracking. "All of 'em. The heater died second night. The wind, it just went right through the walls." Elsbeth did not smile. There was no joy in his loss, only the grim confirmation of her engineering. "The earth keeps its own, Thaddeus," she said, her voice carrying easily over the frozen distance. "You fought the winter. I let the winter insulate me." She gestured for him to come closer, seeing the pride drain out of him, replaced by a hungry, humble confusion. He climbed over the buried fence, snow up to his thighs, and approached the trench she had dug. "How?" he asked, staring down into the dark, warm throat of the dugout. "It's 40 below with the wind. How?" "Come inside," Elsbeth said, stepping aside to let the skeptic pass. Thaddeus descended the snow stairs, ducking his head to enter the space he had once called a grave. He stood in the center of the room, peeling off his heavy gloves. He held his hands out, not to a stove, but to the air itself. He felt the warmth radiating from the walls, the stored summer heat slowly releasing from the tons of dirt surrounding them. He looked at the ventilation shaft, feeling the gentle updraft, realizing the dryness of the air. He looked at the birds, pecking at grain, alive and vibrant. He touched the adobe wall, feeling the absence of the biting chill that permeated every inch of his own expensive, vertical barn. "It's physics," Elsbeth said quietly, standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the blinding white of the exterior. "Thermal mass, geothermal stability. You built a box in the wind. I built a lung in the earth." Thaddeus turned to her, his eyes watering, perhaps from the change in temperature, perhaps from the sheer weight of his error. The arrogance of the autumn was gone, burned away by the frost. "I have no eggs for the town," he whispered. "The general store, the families. My stock is frozen stiff." Elsbeth nodded slowly. She reached into the basket and pulled out 2 brown eggs, holding them out to him. They were still warm. "Take these to your wife, Thaddeus, and when the ground thaws in the spring, bring your boys over. I'll show you how to dig." The legacy of that winter was not written in the history books of the territory, but it was inscribed on the landscape of Blackwood Ridge. In the years that followed, the architecture of the region shifted. The tall, precarious coops and barns that mocked the wind were slowly dismantled, their lumber repurposed for interior furniture or fences. In their place, the hillsides began to sprout doors. Foreign dugouts, they were called, though Elsbeth never asked for the credit. Farmers who had once laughed at the widow now came to her with sketches and questions about soil density, roof pitch, and ventilation ratios. She answered them all with the same stoic patience she applied to her flock, correcting their angles, teaching them to read the sun, teaching them that in the high plains, humility before nature was the only engineering that lasted. Elsbeth Thorne lived to see her niece Ada grow strong and capable, a woman who understood that true competence was not about imposing one's will on the world, but about understanding the world's will and aligning with it. The dugout remained, decades later, a testament to that philosophy. Even after the railway brought coal and cheap lumber, and modern heating systems made vertical buildings feasible again, the old dugout stood. It became a cellar, then a storage shed, but the bones of it, the locust posts, the perfect orientation to the south, the breathing roof, remained intact. It stood as a reminder that when the sky turns white and the wind screams, the safest place to be is not standing tall against the storm, but held safe in the warm, logical embrace of the earth.